The Spanish sun, a golden, arrogant eye, beat down upon the bay of Cadiz. It was May of 1587, and this sprawling, fortified harbour was less a port and more the beating, lavish heart of the world's most terrifying empire. Here, anchored in the sheltered waters, lay the logistical masterpiece of King Philip II, the vast, unshakable foundation of the planned Armada Invincible. The sight defied competition. From the ramparts, a Spanish sentry could gaze upon a seemingly endless forest of masts, gargantuan galleons built for war, alongside hundreds of transports, patakes, and victuallers, each one groaning under the weight of an entire nation's preparation for conquest. The atmosphere was one of profound, casual arrogance. No one in Spain, from the lowliest deckhand to the highest admiral, believed this harbour was vulnerable. It was considered the safest, most impregnable logistical hub on the planet, protected not just by the formidable stone castles that ringed the inlet, but by the sheer, overwhelming, unassailable presence of its occupants. These ships were not merely vessels, they were the conduits of Philip's divine mission. They carried the American gold that bankrolled every war across Europe, the heavy-caliber cannons cast in Seville, the thousands upon thousands of meticulously constructed barrels filled with hardtack, salted beef, and wine, the very sustenance for the soldiers destined to land on England's shores. Everything the Armada needed for its year-long voyage and subsequent invasion was concentrated here, waiting for the final, inexorable mobilization order. It was a singular point of failure, but one that was guarded by such numbers and such fortifications that contemplating an attack felt like an act of theatrical insanity. The sheer scale of the operation created a profound sense of security. The Spanish believed that strength lay in mass, in the impossible geometry of their numbers. They had 20 major warships, the pride of Castile, at anchor, ready to respond to any possible threat. Yet, unseen beyond the headlands, a shadow was approaching. A ridiculously small English fleet, comprising just 4 of the Queen's fighting ships and a handful of auxiliary vessels, was sailing straight toward this Leviathan. Their leader, a man notorious across the Spanish Main and loathed in the Escorial, knew exactly what this harbour represented. Not a fleet to be defeated ship by ship, but an entire logistical system, an empire's vital organ, that could be excised with a single, precise, and impossible strike. To conventional military minds, the act of sailing into Cadiz was nothing less than suicide. The odds were so heavily weighted, the defenses so comprehensive, that the approaching mission should have resulted in an instantaneous, humiliating massacre. But the man commanding the English ships did not deal in convention. He dealt in audacity, in speed, and in the exploitation of enemy complacency. He understood that the Spanish strength, their over-reliance on static defenses and their profound belief in their own divine invincibility, was also their greatest weakness. He wasn't coming to fight a battle of equal measure. He was coming to strike a symbolic, paralyzing blow at the very heart of Spanish pride and preparation. It was an action so reckless, so disproportionate to the forces involved, that it would forever be remembered in naval history, not as a major engagement, but as an act of singular, audacious piracy. For England, this was the final, desperate roll of the dice. For Spain, it was a day of sun-drenched ease that was about to be obliterated by fire and confusion. The fate of 2 global powers, the Catholic giant and the Protestant island, was about to hang upon the discipline and daring of a handful of ships that the Spanish had not even bothered to count. As Drake's tiny fleet crept toward the juggernaut of Cadiz, the high stakes were not merely tactical, they were existential. The conflict unfolding was not a skirmish between 2 naval powers. It was the final, brutal confrontation between 2 incompatible visions for the future of Europe. Philip II, the King of Spain, saw himself as the divine custodian of the Catholic faith and the unchallengeable master of a global empire fueled by the gold of the New World. He commanded resources that dwarfed England's in every measurable way, men, money, and ships, and he was prepared to spend every last doubloon and man to extinguish the Protestant heresy that was Elizabeth's England. His invasion, the Armada, was less a military campaign and more a crusade of absolute vengeance. For Queen Elizabeth I, the situation was nothing short of a final countdown. Her nation was isolated, its treasury perpetually strained, and its political foundation shaky. England was a small island nation, recently and reluctantly Protestant, facing down the organized, overwhelming military might of the single wealthiest empire the world had ever known. Every court in Europe was betting against her. France, politically divided and wary of Spanish power, offered no meaningful aid. The Dutch, locked in their own brutal war of independence against Philip, could only offer desperate solidarity. England stood alone, bankrupt, and desperately outmatched. The problem facing Elizabeth was not how to win a war, but how to survive the imminent, foregone conclusion of a Spanish victory. Philip's strategic goal was brutally simple: regime change. He intended to land a massive army led by the Duke of Parma on the Kent coast, depose Elizabeth, reimpose Catholicism, and integrate England into the sprawling Habsburg dominion. The sheer meticulousness of the Spanish preparation made the threat feel utterly inescapable. Every forge, rope maker, and shipwright in Spain and Portugal worked tirelessly to provision the massive fleet. The scale of the endeavor was designed to induce paralysis and terror. Spanish propaganda, spread across the continent, painted the Armada as invincible before it even sailed, a psychological weapon aimed squarely at shattering English resolve before the first cannon fired. In London, the fear was palpable. The Privy Council was rife with conflicting advice, some advocating for frantic defensive measures, others counseling a cautious, almost humiliating appeasement. The established naval leadership, conservative and trained in the doctrines of the past, could offer no credible plan to counter an invasion of this magnitude. They envisioned a defensive line in the Channel, a strategy that would have inevitably failed against Philip's sheer numbers. Paralysis by bureaucracy and fear gripped the governing class, making their preparations sluggish and desperately insufficient. The traditional military machine was frozen, facing a threat that exceeded its capacity for imagination. This was the desolate, high-stakes global context into which Sir Francis Drake was thrust. His mission to Cadiz was a desperate Hail Mary, a venture financed not by the state treasury, but by private merchants driven by the terrifying proximity of the threat. It was a recognition that conventional means were exhausted. The survival of the Protestant faith, the fragile independence of England, and the life of the Queen herself hinged upon one profoundly risky proposition: that a man considered a pirate and a liability could perform an act of such impossible audacity that it would buy the nation the time it no longer had. Without a decisive, preemptive strike to disrupt Philip's perfect timetable, England's final countdown would reach zero, extinguishing the last flicker of independent resistance in Europe. The impending clash at Cadiz, and the wider war it represented, was far more than a territorial dispute between crowns. It was a brutal struggle for the soul of the continent, fueled by two irreconcilable forces: religious fervor and economic power. On one side stood Catholic Spain, led by the ascetic, unwavering Philip II. His ambition was theological as much as it was political. He viewed himself as the ultimate defender of the true faith, and England, under the excommunicated Elizabeth, was a hotbed of heresy that needed to be surgically removed from the body of Christian Europe. This religious imperative lent the Spanish Armada its formidable, unyielding resolve. Every man sailing for Philip believed he was participating in a holy war, an effort blessed by God and directed by Providence. This faith provided an intangible, almost terrifying strength to the Spanish cause, making their failure seem, to them, literally impossible. But this divine mandate was ruthlessly underwritten by gold. The constant, dizzying flow of bullion from the silver mines of Potosi and the rich colonies of the Americas provided Spain with an economic power the likes of which Europe had never seen. This gold was the true fuel of the empire, enabling Philip to construct the largest fleet in history, to pay the vast armies of Flanders, and to sustain continuous war for decades. Spain's wealth created an aura of impregnability. They simply could not be outspent, outprepared, or ultimately defeated. The very existence of this wealth dictated the strategies of their enemies. It was less about winning territory and more about trying to cut the financial throat of the beast. Against this monolith stood Protestant England, fighting for something far less tangible than gold: survival. England's resources were pitiful by comparison. Its military spending was funded by customs duties and meager taxes, a pittance next to Philip's American treasure. England's strength was not in its treasury, but in its desperate resolve and the emerging philosophy of self-reliance spurred by the Reformation. The war became a popular cause, a fight for the right to govern themselves, worship freely, and exist outside the control of a massive foreign power. The English, though outclassed, fought with the ferocity of those defending their own hearths and homes, an emotionally potent drive that often surprised their better-equipped adversaries. This deep ideological rift was reflected in the very nature of their navies. Spanish ships were designed for transport and to carry vast armies, prioritizing capacity and defensive strength, a reflection of their methodical, overwhelming approach. English ships, often converted merchantmen or built with speed in mind, embodied the spirit of private enterprise and desperate mobility. They were faster, lighter, and more reliant on innovation than brute force. They were the tools of a nation that knew it could not afford to fight a conventional war. Drake's raid on Cadiz, therefore, was not merely a naval attack. It was a direct assault on the economic and spiritual confidence of the Spanish Empire. By daring to strike at the heart of the supply chain, the gold-backed preparations, Drake aimed to prove that Philip's divine mission and his vast wealth did not make him untouchable. The Cadiz raid was the ultimate gamble of the underdog, using cunning and speed to disrupt the colossal, slow-moving machine. It was a defiant, screaming statement from an island nation that refused to accept the narrative of its own inevitable doom, a contest where the discipline forged in desperation would be pitted against the lethargy bred by absolute power. The great contest was not yet won, but in the small, audacious actions of men like Drake, the balance of power was beginning to shift, one burnt galleon at a time. In the face of the overwhelming threat detailed in the previous chapter, the response from the official organs of the English state was one of suffocating caution. The Privy Council and the Lord High Admiral, Lord Howard of Effingham, were career statesmen, cautious, methodical, and profoundly conventional. They understood the rules of naval engagement as dictated by tradition and bureaucracy, and those rules dictated that no English fleet, no matter how skilled, could stand against the full might of the Spanish Armada in a straight fight. Their plans focused on coastal defenses, mustering militias, and pleading for funds, a desperate, reactive strategy predicated on enduring the inevitable storm. But Elizabeth, despite her cautious nature and her own financial anxieties, recognized the fatal flaw in this defensive paralysis. To wait for Philip to launch his armada was to guarantee defeat. England needed a preemptive, devastating blow, a surgical strike that would disrupt the Armada's timetable and sow chaos into their immaculate preparations. It required an act of such staggering audacity that no established, cautious officer would even contemplate it, let alone execute it. The solution was politically toxic, militarily unorthodox, and morally dubious, but absolutely necessary: Sir Francis Drake. Drake was, in the eyes of the European courts, a pirate, a master thief of the unknown world, as the Spanish repeatedly and furiously labeled him. In England, he was a celebrity, but also a liability. He was notoriously insubordinate, impatient with bureaucracy, and possessed a reckless streak that terrified the financiers who paid for the Queen's campaigns. He was not a nobleman, but a self-made adventurer whose immense wealth was derived from seizing Spanish treasure. Appointing him to lead a vital national mission was, to the aristocratic naval establishment, an appointment of despite, a desperate turning to the last, most unpredictable option available. The debate in the council was vicious. Opponents argued that Drake would only inflame Philip further, provoking a faster and more furious response. They feared his lack of discipline and the potential for him to start a war they were entirely unprepared to fight. But the pragmatists, led by key figures like Francis Walsingham, saw the ruthless logic. Drake was the only man with the experience, the speed, and the sheer audacity to sail into a heavily guarded Spanish harbour and live to tell the tale. His knowledge of the Spanish Main and his history of infuriating the King of Spain made him the perfect, personalized weapon for the task. The resulting orders given to Drake were themselves a study in political cowardice. Elizabeth authorized him to impeach the joining together of the King of Spain's forces, a deliberately vague command that allowed the Queen plausible deniability should the mission fail disastrously. It was a license to attempt the suicidal mission of striking Cadiz, but with no formal military backing and the very real threat of a court-martial waiting for him upon any return, be it glorious or disastrous. This fragile, desperate mandate solidified Drake's unique position. He was not an admiral of the fleet in the traditional sense, but a weapon unleashed by a desperate queen. He understood that his authority rested entirely on success. He was sailing not just against the Spanish Empire, but against the ingrained skepticism of his own government. The mission was against all logic, defying every established rule of warfare, and its very execution was seen as an act of insanity by every seasoned naval mind. But Drake accepted the commission, viewing the impossibility of the odds not as a deterrent, but as the clearest possible proof that the genius of his plan lay precisely in its unprecedented daring. To understand the audacity of the Cadiz raid, one must first understand the man who conceived it, Sir Francis Drake. He was not born into the privileged, gentle world of naval command. He was the product of humble, devoutly Protestant beginnings, the son of a tenant farmer turned lay preacher in Devon. This background, far from the aristocracy that commanded the Queen's official navy, instilled in him a fierce independence, a deep suspicion of institutional authority, and a burning, visceral hatred for the Catholic power that defined his childhood. His family was forced to flee during the religious persecutions of Queen Mary I, and this early life as a fugitive imprinted upon him a sense of permanent displacement and a profound conviction that his faith and his nation's freedom were always under threat. Drake's training ground was not the polite drawing rooms of the Admiralty, but the raw, brutal crucible of the sea. He began his career as a young man sailing with his cousin, John Hawkins, on voyages that quickly morphed from legitimate trade into the hazardous, often merciless world of privateering and the early slave trade. It was a life lived constantly on the edge of legality, where survival depended on ruthlessness, quick thinking, and a willingness to defy conventional morality. This environment shaped his genius. He learned the rhythm of the waves, the psychology of his crew, and the unforgiving calculus of risk long before he ever commanded a royal fleet. Crucially, Drake carried a personal vendetta against the Spanish crown that was far deeper than mere political allegiance. It was forged in the fire of betrayal. He had once believed in the possibility of negotiated trade, only to be ambushed and treacherously betrayed by the Spanish at the Battle of San Juan de Ulua in 1568. Though he escaped with his life, Drake was left humiliated, with his fortunes ruined and his confidence in the Spanish word forever shattered. This catastrophic defeat was the single, defining trauma of his early career. It turned a private merchant into an avenging force. From that day forward, Drake's actions were driven by a singular, consuming passion, to strike directly at the source of Spain's power and pride. He became the most effective, most successful privateer in history, raiding Spanish settlements and capturing treasure galleons in acts that earned him the Spanish moniker El Drac, the Dragon. The gold he seized did more than enrich him. It created a self-financing guerrilla warfare against the King of Spain, proving that a single, determined individual could inflict tangible damage on an overwhelming empire. His greatest exploit, the circumnavigation of the globe, was not merely a feat of navigation. It was a brazen act of defiance. By sailing Spanish-claimed waters and returning laden with plunder, he demonstrated that the Spanish claim to global dominion was a fragile illusion. The aristocratic English establishment might have viewed him with suspicion, but the common people saw him as their champion, the single, hardened man of the sea who stood up to the Colossus. This was the man Elizabeth chose for Cadiz, a complex figure driven by a deep, almost fanatical Protestant faith, forged in humiliation, and possessed of a pirate's reckless brilliance that made him the only person capable of the impossible. The tactical genius Drake would later unleash upon Cadiz was not born of formal training or aristocratic lineage. It was forged in the bitter crucible of a single, catastrophic event, the massacre at San Juan de Ulua in 1568. This incident, more than any other, provides the crucial emotional and strategic context for his later, ferocious raids. It was the moment Francis Drake shed his skin as a cautious merchant adventurer and was reborn as a relentless, unforgiving privateer, driven by a personal, burning vendetta against the Spanish crown. The story begins innocently enough. Drake, sailing with his cousin John Hawkins, was engaged in the highly dubious but economically lucrative enterprise of trading enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Their small fleet was caught in a massive storm and forced to seek shelter and vital repairs in the Spanish-controlled port of San Juan de Ulua, near modern-day Veracruz. A temporary truce was established with the local Spanish authorities, allowing the English ships to anchor and begin their necessary work. Hawkins and Drake, trusting in the parole and the laws of hospitality, lowered their guard. Then, everything changed. A massive Spanish treasure fleet, escorting the new Viceroy of Mexico, arrived unexpectedly. Despite initial, nervous agreements to maintain the truce, the Spanish leadership, motivated by religious zeal and a profound contempt for the English heretics, plotted their betrayal. The attack, when it came, was swift, brutal, and utterly treacherous. Under the cover of darkness and a feigned agreement, the Spanish launched a surprise attack on the unsuspecting English fleet. The scene descended instantly into chaos and carnage. The vastly superior Spanish forces, firing from shore and from their own warships, decimated the smaller, trapped English vessels. Drake witnessed firsthand the ruthless deceit of the Spanish command, a shattering realization that in the global conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, there would be no honor, no quarter, and no rules. The English were not just defeated, they were humiliated, their trust betrayed, and their comrades brutally slaughtered. Drake managed to escape the carnage in his small vessel, the Judith, navigating the desperate scramble of the survivors under heavy fire. He returned to England with barely 24 men and a heart full of bitterness and burning fury. The loss was not just financial, nor was it merely military, it was a profound trauma of betrayal. It convinced Drake that the only way to deal with the Spanish Empire was not through negotiation or conventional warfare, but through swift, violent, and preemptive strikes. He swore a solemn oath that day to repay the Spanish for every drop of English blood spilled. This humiliation became the seed of his tactical genius. He realized that the Spanish, blinded by their wealth and their belief in their own moral superiority, were incapable of imagining a truly radical challenge. They relied on fixed rules, vast logistics, and predictable defensive maneuvers. Drake, the survivor of Ulua, would spend the rest of his career proving that a small force, driven by ruthless personal vengeance and a profound rejection of convention, could shatter the fragile confidence of a colossal empire. The raid on Cadiz 19 years later was simply the strategic fulfillment of the promise made on that desperate, bloody day at San Juan de Ulua. The humiliation at San Juan de Ulua and the subsequent years spent in relentless privateering did more than simply fuel Drake's rage. They gave birth to a revolutionary naval doctrine, a philosophy of sea warfare so unconventional it was considered heresy by the established naval minds of the era. The Spanish, and indeed most European navies, adhered to the prevailing doctrine of the time. The ship was a floating castle. Battles were slow, ponderous affairs where the goal was to close the distance, grapple the enemy vessel, and win the fight through sheer force of boarding troops. Naval vessels were primarily transports for soldiers, heavy and slow. Drake entirely rejected this paradigm. He recognized that England, with its limited resources, could never win a war of attrition or a battle decided by the sheer number of soldiers carried. His solution was a tactical philosophy centered on three radical principles: speed, maneuverability, and continuous firepower. First, Drake demanded speed. His ships were built not for cargo or capacity, but for sailing performance. They were faster, lower in the water, and could change tack with a swiftness that bewildered the cumbersome Spanish galleons. This speed allowed him to dictate the terms of engagement. He could choose to strike when and where he wished, and crucially, he could always choose to escape overwhelming force, a critical necessity for the underdog. Second, he championed maneuverability. Drake understood that the cannon was the true weapon of naval warfare, not the soldier. He trained his gunners relentlessly, emphasizing rapid reloading and continuous fire from a distance. The English method involved sailing past the enemy, unleashing a devastating broadside, and then quickly maneuvering out of range while the Spanish slowly attempted to turn their heavy vessels to return fire. This was the genesis of the ship-of-the-line concept, prioritizing the ship itself as a fighting platform. Third, and most destructively, Drake focused on logistics, not glory. While Spanish captains sought the honor of capturing a prized enemy vessel, Drake sought to cripple the enemy's ability to fight. His attacks targeted rigging, masts, rudders, and most importantly, the supplies, the food, powder, and water essential for a long-distance campaign. He grasped the profound, often overlooked truth that a war is won not just by defeating the enemy's fighting ships, but by starving, delaying, and demoralizing their entire apparatus. This was a profoundly cynical and anti-heroic doctrine for the age. It was less about chivalric honor and more about cold, hard, logistical destruction. When Drake first presented his theories, that a small, fast fleet could effectively neutralize a large, slow one, he was met with skepticism and outright ridicule from the established admiralty. His tactics were branded suicidal because they depended on sailing dangerously close to the enemy to maximize cannon damage, relying entirely on the ship's ability to quickly pull away, a feat considered impossible by officers used to heavy, sluggish galleons. But this doctrine was tested and perfected in the white-hot crucible of the Spanish Main. Drake had proven, time and again, that his heresy worked. He had learned that the Spanish reliance on overwhelming size and defensive fortifications led to a psychological weakness. They panicked when the rules were broken. The raid on Cadiz would be the ultimate demonstration of this revolutionary naval doctrine, an attempt to use cunning and speed to shatter a structure built on the obsolete pillars of mass and slow, predictable strength. The finalization of the Cadiz mission in early 1587 was less a strategic plan and more a reluctant signing of a death warrant. The goal, to disrupt the Armada by attacking it in port, violated every known principle of military prudence and naval safety. Yet, Sir Francis Drake, driven by his unique blend of tactical genius and personal venom, convinced Queen Elizabeth to issue the highly ambiguous and politically expedient orders that would launch the raid. The objective was straightforward: sail into the heart of Spain's preparations and destroy everything that floated, burned, or was edible. The logistics were terrifying. Cadiz was not an open harbour, it was a deeply fortified naval base. The narrow entrance was guarded by the formidable cannon placements of the castle of San Sebastian and the city ramparts. Furthermore, a massive defensive chain boom was often stretched across the channel, designed to instantly stop any hostile vessel in its tracks and leave it exposed to shore battery fire. To attempt to breach this in daylight, with a small fleet of lightly armed ships, was an act of war so reckless that King Philip II simply hadn't bothered to prepare for it. The Spanish security rested on the universal assumption that no commander would ever be so foolish as to try. The reaction among Drake's own officers and the auxiliary fleet he was given was one of stunned disbelief and deep, muttered resistance. These were professional sailors, schooled in the conservative doctrines of the time. They understood naval blockades and open-sea engagements, but the idea of sailing into a harbour bristling with shore guns and filled with the entire might of the enemy's logistics was considered the height of recklessness. They rightly viewed the plan as suicidal. The numerical disparity was staggering. Drake was taking fewer than 20 ships, many of them small transports, directly into a bay containing over 60 Spanish vessels, including powerful galleons and dozens of heavily laden supply ships. This profound opposition created a tense, almost mutinous atmosphere aboard the ships as they prepared to sail. Drake, however, was a master psychologist as well as a master mariner. He did not ask his men to believe in the odds. He asked them to believe in speed and surprise. He argued that the Spanish fortress was designed to resist a siege, not a lightning-fast infiltration. He explained his theory: the sheer shock of the attack would shatter Spanish discipline and paralyze their response. He did not need to defeat the Spanish in a formal battle. He only needed to create chaos and fire, striking with precision and exploiting the seconds of disorientation that his unprecedented maneuver would create. His mission was a gamble against time and complacency. He knew that for his plan to work, the Spanish had to be caught in the precise moment between preparation and launch, before the full defensive measures were in place and while the supply ships were still crowded together. If the element of surprise was lost for even a few hours, the entire fleet would be instantly annihilated. It was a mission against all military logic, a desperate play where success relied not on strength, but on the exploitation of the enemy's most cherished and arrogant assumption, that the English were too terrified to strike first. Drake's departure for Cadiz was not heralded by fanfare, but by the nervous silence of men who believed they were sailing towards certain doom, led by a man who had made a career out of defying inevitability. The journey across the Bay of Biscay was swift, yet fraught with tension, a silent race against the clock. Drake knew that secrecy was his most powerful weapon, and every hour his presence remained unknown was an hour that multiplied his slender chances of survival. On the morning of April 29, 1587, the English fleet, a paltry collection of 4 major Queen's ships, 2 pinnaces, and a handful of auxiliary vessels, arrived off the southwest coast of Spain, shrouded in the humid haze that clung to the Strait of Gibraltar. The approach to Cadiz was a masterclass in controlled aggression. Drake ordered his ships to maintain a distance until the very last moment, using the coastal geography and the prevailing sea mist, the true fog of war, to obscure their numbers and intent. The moment of commitment arrived with the first sighting of the massive Spanish logistics hub. From a distance, the density of the masts was staggering, confirming the reports that the entire logistical apparatus of the Armada was indeed concentrated and vulnerable. The Spanish watchmen, posted high on the towers of the city, were complacent. They were accustomed to seeing the movement of friendly vessels, and the idea of an English fleet venturing this far south, let alone attempting a direct attack, was a joke whispered over cups of wine. Their primary defense was not alertness, but sheer psychological deterrence. When the English sails were finally spotted, the initial reaction was not alarm, but confusion, followed by disbelief. Surely these were renegade traders, not a hostile force. Drake, however, gave the Spanish no time to move from disbelief to coordinated defense. His command ship, the Elizabeth Bonaventure, surged forward, leading the advance with a speed that startled the following captains. The initial order was not to slow down or even pause to assess the situation. It was a desperate, headlong charge into the enemy's teeth. The goal was to reach the inner harbour before the Spanish could organize their defensive boom, or worse, before the powerful land batteries could coordinate their fire and zero in on the narrow entrance. The terrifying race began. The English ships sliced into the outer harbour, directly under the gaping muzzles of the shore batteries. The Spanish guns, built to repel distant fleets or a slow-moving siege, took precious minutes to train on the fast-moving, unconventional targets. Those minutes were all the grace Drake needed. The initial Spanish cannon fire was wild and uncoordinated, the consequence of complacency and a total lack of practice against such a close-quarters infiltration. As the small English fleet drove deeper, the alarm finally began to spread. The bells of Cadiz started to ring wildly, the sound echoing across the water, replacing the quiet morning bustle with a rising wave of panic. But the Spanish commanders were still struggling with the fundamental problem. They had been prepared for a distant war, not a fight inside their own living room. The moment the English ships passed the outer defenses and the towering fortress guns, the element of surprise was partially successful. Drake had gotten his tiny force past the front door, but the real, impossible battle lay waiting. Over 60 Spanish ships now lay directly ahead, trapped and beginning their frenzied attempts to arm and maneuver in the narrow confines. The initial stealth was over, and the chaos was about to begin. Drake's daring infiltration of Cadiz harbour now slammed headlong into the Spanish final, desperate attempt at defense. As the English ships raced past the wildly firing shore batteries, the inner harbour presented its final obstacle, the chain boom. This formidable physical barrier, a thick chain reinforced with wooden floats and cables stretched across the narrowest point of the inner channel, was the Spanish failsafe. It was designed to halt any vessel instantly, turning the intruder into a stationary, helpless target for the coordinated fire of the surrounding galleons and the city ramparts. The Spanish commanders, frantic but regaining some composure, had managed to maneuver several large armed galleys, long, oared vessels perfect for navigating confined waters, to guard the boom. These galleys represented the traditional, aggressive close-quarters fighting style that was meant to crush the English interlopers. The odds were now at their most terrifying. Drake had to destroy the boom, fight off the galleys, and somehow maintain the lightning speed that was his only defense, all while sailing into the dense, armed mass of the Spanish logistics fleet. It was here that the unconventional speed and discipline of the English crews proved their worth. Drake did not stop to engage the Spanish galleys in a protracted, ship-to-ship duel. Instead, he ordered a single, devastating, concentrated attack on the boom itself. The lead ship, likely the Elizabeth Bonaventure, did not rely on the clumsy, time-consuming process of trying to cut the chain. Drake's doctrine was one of shock and maneuver. The English employed their heavy-caliber culverins, firing at point-blank range, not at the ships, but at the anchor points and the wooden supports holding the chain taut. This was the hammer blow, a focused, violent application of concentrated firepower designed to create structural failure. The sound was deafening, a roaring testament to the raw kinetic force unleashed in the narrow confines. The Spanish galleys, relying on boarding tactics, were caught in the open, unable to grapple the English ships which were moving too fast, and were shredded by the continuous, disciplined fire from the English broadsides. This was the moment of shattered confidence for the Spanish. Their defense mechanisms were proving utterly useless against this relentless, unprecedented maneuver. As the anchor points buckled and the thick, taut chain finally snapped under the sustained, punishing bombardment, a gaping breach was torn in the Spanish defenses. Drake's ships surged through the opening with barely a pause, leaving the defending galleys confused and scattered. The initial, planned paralysis of the Spanish command, that fleeting moment of chaos Drake had counted on, had been successfully exploited. The English were now inside the inner harbour, a space the Spanish considered sacrosanct and unreachable. This audacious breakthrough immediately rendered the remaining Spanish tactical options obsolete. The galleons, many of which were still raising sails and attempting to organize a defense, were trapped. Their great size, designed for the open ocean, now worked against them in the crowded, shallow waters. They could not turn quickly enough to meet the fast-moving English threat, and their cannons, built to fire at distance, could not effectively target the enemy at such close, frenetic quarters. Drake had engineered the single, critical moment of tactical genius. He had inverted the battle space, turning the Spanish greatest asset, their massive number of anchored ships, into a dense, vulnerable collection of targets, ripe for destruction. The English fleet, tiny and battered, was now loose in the Empire's treasure room, and the fire and chaos that would cripple the Armada were about to begin. The moment Drake's ships breached the boom and surged into the inner harbour, the disciplined Spanish preparations dissolved into a maelstrom of terror and confusion. The massive Spanish fleet, designed and marshalled for an open-sea confrontation with England's navy, was suddenly attacked from within its supposed sanctuary. This was not war as they understood it. It was a violation of military geography, a nightmare scenario the Spanish commanders, accustomed to the slow, methodical processes of imperial war, had never seriously factored into their defense plans. The sheer density of the anchored ships, their greatest pride, now became their greatest vulnerability. The harbor was a choked, crowded space, filled with supply vessels, armed merchantmen, and the hulking, slow-turning galleons. The Spanish fleet was like a herd of cattle driven into a tight corral, and Drake was a wolf now loose among them. The commanders, still reeling from the shock of the breach, issued a flurry of conflicting, useless orders. Some called for the ships to weigh anchor and attempt to ram the invaders. Others demanded they deploy boarding parties. Still others frantically tried to train their heavy cannons on the fast-moving English targets. The problem was one of impassable geometry. The massive Spanish galleons required significant space to pivot and bring their powerful broadsides to bear. In the confined waters of the harbor, every maneuver was a liability. Sails were fouling, lines were tangling, and ships were colliding in the smoke and rising panic. Their huge cannons, built for engaging distant ships on the open ocean, were almost useless against the small, quick English vessels that were able to sail daringly close before pulling away. The English gunners, in contrast, were practicing their new doctrine perfectly: strike fast and move faster. The Spanish officers, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy and slow pace of Habsburg bureaucracy, found their command structure paralyzed. There was no single, unified plan for an internal attack, and the sight of their immense, valuable supply ships being systematically targeted by the English fireships and rapid cannon fire caused their resolve to shatter. The crews, many of them pressed men or unfamiliar with immediate, close-quarters combat, began to exhibit signs of open insubordination and flight. Some captains, realizing the impossibility of maneuvering their vessels, ordered anchors cut in a desperate bid to drift out of the conflict zone or beach themselves to avoid capture or fire. This moment was the tactical climax of Drake's genius. He didn't need to sink every Spanish ship. He needed to shatter their confidence and induce psychological meltdown. The panic was infectious, spreading from the captains down to the lowliest sailors. The realization dawned that their great armada, the invincible force destined for England, was not only vulnerable but was being meticulously, ruthlessly picked apart in its own home. The Spanish soldiers, brave on land, were terrified of the fire spreading uncontrollably among the supply vessels, a chaos far worse than any orderly sea fight. The smoke, the screams, the wild ringing of church bells, and the sight of their precious war material erupting in flames created an overwhelming sense of helplessness. In the narrow confines of Cadiz, Spanish morale, wealth, and strategic integrity were collapsing under the weight of unprecedented, close-quarters anarchy. Having successfully shattered the Spanish command structure and induced panic in the confines of the harbour, Drake moved to execute the most destructive component of his plan, the calculated use of fire. This was not the accidental ignition of battle, it was a deliberate, tactical application of terror, and it focused almost entirely on the immense fleet of supply vessels that constituted the Armada's logistical heart. Drake understood that sinking a few warships was a trophy, but burning the enemy's food and future was the path to ultimate victory. The Spanish supply ships, known as audacious, were large, slow merchantmen laden with every essential for a long-distance invasion, thousands of barrels of beef and flour, countless tons of gunpowder, spare rigging, and perhaps most critically, the dry wood and flammable stores needed for the long voyage. They were floating warehouses, sitting ducks in the crowded harbour. Drake immediately ordered the targeting of these vessels. Some were engaged with rapid cannon fire, tearing holes in their hulls below the waterline, but the true psychological weapon was the fireship. The English sailors rapidly converted several smaller captured vessels into rudimentary hell ships. These were stripped, filled with combustible materials like tar, pitch, and dry timber, set alight, and then deliberately steered into the dense clusters of Spanish supply ships. The scene became an inferno that transcended naval warfare. The Spanish crews, already demoralized and unable to maneuver, watched in horror as these blazing hulks drifted inexorably toward their own vessels. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Fire, in the age of wooden ships, was the ultimate enemy, and in the crowded confines of Cadiz, it was unstoppable. When one supply ship caught fire, the blaze quickly leaped to its neighbors. The air filled with the deafening cracks of exploding gunpowder stores and the terrifying rush of flames consuming wood and sail. The intense heat and smoke created an environment of pure chaos. Spanish sailors and soldiers, even the toughest veterans, were gripped by a primal terror, realizing they were trapped between the attacking English on one side and an advancing wall of flame on the other. This was the core strategic genius of the raid. Drake was destroying the duration of the Armada. The destruction of the ships was secondary to the destruction of the provisions. Every barrel of salted meat burned, every rope and canvas sail consumed by the flames, extended the Spanish mobilization by weeks, if not months. The burning of the audacious meant the Spanish army would have to start the massive process of victualling the entire fleet from scratch, a logistical nightmare in the 16th century. The Spanish commanders, realizing the gravity of this destruction, could only resort to cutting their anchors in a frantic, often failed attempt to let the tides or the wind push their burning vessels clear. Many ships were deliberately run aground or scuttled to prevent the fire from spreading further into the city's docks. Drake's relentless attack, lasting a full 2 days, turned the pride of Philip's logistics into a vast, smoking pyre. This calculated application of fire and water resulted in a strategic blow that was far more damaging than any fleet engagement. The genesis of the Hell ships in Cadiz showed the world that a war could be won not just by fighting the enemy, but by burning his breakfast. Drake's raid had now descended into a relentless, 2-day-long operation of systematic destruction, a stark contrast to the quick, glorious victory expected by traditional naval commanders. This was not a pursuit of naval honor. It was a ruthless campaign of economic and logistical warfare, focused entirely on dismantling the Spanish Armada's supply chain. Drake correctly identified that the true weakness of the massive invasion force was not its fighting ships, but its stomach, its dependence on thousands of tons of provisions to sustain a long, arduous campaign in hostile waters. The inner harbor became the designated target zone. Drake ordered his ships to repeatedly engage and destroy the supply galleons, audacious, and vitaliers, ships often overlooked in the heat of battle but absolutely vital to the Spanish plan. These vessels were the floating larders and armories of the Armada, carrying everything needed to keep an army of 30,000 men alive for months at sea and upon landing in England. The English approach was surgical, precise, and profoundly destructive. They ignored the heavily armed Spanish galleons where possible, allowing them to flounder in their own confusion, and concentrated their cannon fire on the softer, more vulnerable hulls of the transports. They did not just sink them. They focused on shattering the barrels of salted meat, dried fish, hardtack biscuit, and fresh water. Imagine the chaos, the sickening sight of vital sustenance, months of preparation, spilling into the foul waters of the harbor, instantly rendered useless. The Spanish had amassed these provisions over a year. Drake was undoing that work in a matter of hours. The destruction of the cooperage, or barrel-making supplies, was arguably the most damaging single blow. In the 16th century, barrels were the essential technology for preserving and transporting food and water. Without properly cured wood and skilled coopers, the Spanish could not replace the thousands of destroyed containers. Any new provisions they tried to gather would quickly spoil. This single detail reveals the depth of Drake's strategic thinking. He was not just burning food, he was destroying the means to store food. As the supply ships burned and sank, the psychological toll on the Spanish command was immense. The admirals witnessed the core of their operational readiness, the months of bureaucratic and logistical planning, going up in smoke. This was not a glorious defeat, it was a humiliating, systematic dismantling by an inferior force. The Spanish army, waiting patiently for their invasion fleet, were now, in effect, starved before they even set sail. Drake ensured his raid was thorough. For 36 hours, despite increasing resistance from shore batteries and the few remaining armed Spanish ships, the English fleet maintained the high tempo of destruction. They methodically sailed through the bay, setting fire to ships, cutting lines, and forcing captains to scuttle their own vessels to prevent them from becoming fireships that would endanger others. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Over 30 major vessels, mostly supply transports, were destroyed, along with immense stores of vital war materials. This battle of the supply fleet was the true strategic masterpiece of Cadiz. It proved that a small, swift, disciplined force could paralyze a colossal, slow-moving empire. By targeting the empire's stomach, Drake successfully inflicted a wound that could not be healed by mere bravery or greater numbers. He had not won the war, but he had effectively stolen the Spanish Armada's entire nutritional budget, ensuring that the fleet, whenever it finally sailed, would be compromised, hungry, and dangerously ill-equipped for a long voyage. As the smoke began to clear over the ravaged Bay of Cadiz, the true significance of Drake's raid emerged, transcending the mere destruction of ships and supplies. This was not just a military victory. It was a devastating psychological blow delivered directly to the heart and pride of King Philip II of Spain. It was this act of audacious defiance that Drake famously dubbed singeing the King of Spain's beard. The metaphor was perfect in its insolence and its accuracy. The king's beard represented his dignity, his inviolability, and the very face of his absolute power. To strike at the main mobilization port of his Invincible Armada, a force he believed was blessed by God and entirely beyond the reach of his enemies, was an act of personal humiliation on a scale rarely seen in European warfare. Drake had not just challenged Philip's navy, He had publicly mocked the king's meticulous preparations and exposed the fundamental vulnerability of his global authority. Philip II was a ruler obsessed with control, order, and the divine right of his mission. He governed his empire from the quiet sanctity of El Escorial, relying on slow, detailed correspondence and the absolute assurance that his military machine operated with perfect, predictable efficiency. The news from Cadiz, when it finally reached him, must have been utterly paralyzing. It was not a report of a glorious naval defeat, but of chaos, confusion, and utter systemic failure in his most secure, most vital harbor. It was the antithesis of the order he prized. The psychological impact was profound. The raid shattered the carefully cultivated aura of invincibility that surrounded the Armada. For years, Spanish propaganda had reassured all of Europe that the invasion was a foregone conclusion. Now, a small force, led by a man the king branded a common pirate, had sailed unopposed into the heart of Spanish naval power, burned a third of its logistics, and sailed away almost unharmed. The raid proved that the Spanish defenses, formidable as they looked on paper, were brittle when confronted with unprecedented speed and surprise. Furthermore, Drake's audacious act gave immense, immediate morale boost to England. The English people, living under the shadow of imminent invasion and surrounded by fear, suddenly had a moment of roaring triumph. It proved that the Spanish giant, however enormous, could bleed. This psychological shift was crucial. It replaced the debilitating sense of fatalism with a renewed, desperate courage, convincing the English that the fight was not lost before it began. For Philip, the public embarrassment was compounded by the strategic damage. He was now forced to confront the reality that his enemy was capable of striking anywhere, anytime, shattering his timetable and forcing him to divert immense resources to securing his own coastlines. Drake's singeing was a calculated act of terror that served to delay, demoralize, and fundamentally compromise the Armada, ensuring that when the great fleet finally sailed the following year, it would be burdened by makeshift repairs, spoiled provisions, and the heavy psychological weight of a very public, very profound humiliation. The King of Spain's beard had been singed, and the scorching wound would last until the final defeat of his armada. After nearly 2 days of unparalleled destruction within the inner harbor, having systematically burned the armada's provisions and shattered Spanish morale, Drake was faced with the final, most hazardous phase of his mission, the retreat. The act of breaking into Cadiz had been audacious. The act of sailing out was potentially suicidal. The element of surprise was utterly gone, replaced by a mobilized, furious Spanish defense that had finally found its focus, revenge. The English fleet, though victorious in its primary objective, was now low on powder, its rigging damaged by Spanish fire, and its crews exhausted. The harbor entrance, the narrow channel that Drake had so brilliantly breached, was now a choke point of concentrated peril. The Spanish, no longer paralyzed, had rushed soldiers and artillery to the fortress batteries on both sides of the channel. This stretch of water was transformed into a deadly gauntlet, a corridor where Drake's ships would be sailing slowly against wind and tide, entirely exposed to heavy cannon fire. Drake's brilliance was again demonstrated in his mastery of controlled withdrawal. He did not attempt a panicked dash for freedom. Instead, he employed a tactical feint, moving his ships deeper into the outer bay before turning to face the gauntlet. This maneuver forced the Spanish commanders to guess his exit point and spread their defenses thinly. As he finally began his retreat, he adopted a strategy of continuous, aggressive fire, utilizing the very discipline he had instilled in his gun crews. The English ships did not simply sail past. They engaged the shore batteries fiercely, using their remaining shot to suppress the Spanish fire and protect their own hulls. The scene was one of ferocious tension. Cannonballs slammed into the water, throwing up geysers around the small English vessels. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning powder and wood. Crucially, the Spanish gunners, though numerous, were largely inexperienced in targeting fast-moving ships at sea level. They were trained for static defense, and the speed and evasive maneuvers of the English fleet continued to frustrate their aim. Furthermore, Drake used the spoils of his victory as a shield. He had captured several prize vessels, Spanish supply ships too valuable to burn entirely, and used these heavier, slower ships to form a temporary rearguard, absorbing some of the devastating fire and slowing the attempts of the Spanish galleys to pursue. This calculated sacrifice allowed his primary fighting ships to gain crucial distance. The passage was slow, agonizing, and required immaculate timing from every English captain to avoid collision and maintain formation under fire. Yet, by late afternoon on the second day, Drake successfully steered his entire fleet, battered but intact, out of the killing zone and into the open ocean. The implications of this impossible retreat were as important as the raid itself. Drake had not only inflicted massive logistical damage, but he had demonstrated to the Spanish that he could dictate the terms of engagement and survive their maximum effort. He had sailed into the lion's mouth, destroyed its food source, and escaped its jaws. The failure of the Spanish to sink or capture a single English vessel during the retreat was a final, damning indictment of their lack of training and their reliance on static, predictable defense against Drake's fluid, dynamic naval heresy. The pirate had emerged victorious from the gauntlet, leaving behind a smoking ruin that guaranteed the delay and ultimate compromise of the Armada. As Drake's ships finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a smoking, ruinous harbour, the Spanish were left to survey the damage. The immediate tactical victory belonged entirely to the English, but the true magnitude of the loss was not simply the 30-odd ships that were sunk, captured, or burned. The uncounted loss lay in the destruction of the Armada's readiness, a blow that crippled the entire invasion timetable for a critical year. This was the strategic masterstroke of the Cadiz raid. The tangible losses were staggering enough. The Spanish crown estimated the immediate material damage at over 172,000 ducats, a vast sum, but the true cost was in the irreplaceable logistical resources. Drake had methodically targeted the audacious, supply ships that carried the bulk of the Armada's provisions. When these ships went up in flames, the Spanish lost their meticulously gathered stocks of dried biscuits, wine, vinegar, and, most critically, thousands of water and food casks. In the 16th century, replacing this scale of loss was a monumental task that could not be achieved quickly. Every barrel, every ton of preserved food, had been sourced, prepared, and stored over many months. The destruction meant that the entire victualling process, the bureaucratic nightmare of financing, acquiring, preparing, and transporting provisions, had to begin almost from scratch. The provisions that could be gathered quickly were often green, poor-quality food hastily stored in new, unseasoned casks, which would inevitably leak and spoil the contents on a long voyage. This fact alone guaranteed that the Spanish forces would face disease and malnutrition before they even sighted the English Channel. The psychological devastation was also an uncounted loss. The confidence of the captains and the morale of the crews, already shaken by the chaos in the harbour, were profoundly undermined. The sight of their own government unable to defend its most vital port created a crippling sense of vulnerability. Philip II, typically slow to anger but implacable in his resolve, was initially enraged, but his reaction quickly shifted to a frustrating, methodical attempt to repair the damage. The most crucial consequence, however, was the strategic delay. Philip II had planned to launch the Armada in the summer of 1587. The Cadiz raid made that timeline utterly impossible. The destruction of the masts, rigging, timber, and anchors meant that the massive shipbuilding program was set back by at least 10 to 12 months. This year-long delay was the silent, invaluable victory of the raid. This gifted time was everything to England. It allowed Queen Elizabeth and her ministers to finally mobilize, consolidate their defenses, gather more funds, and most importantly, finish the construction and fitting out of their own, smaller fighting fleet. While Spain frantically scoured Europe for new provisions and repaired its shattered vessels, England gained the breathing room it needed to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The aftermath of Ashes at Cadiz was not a total destruction of the Armada, but the theft of its timing and its preparation, guaranteeing that when the Invincible fleet finally sailed, it would be an inferior, sick, and demoralized force, destined for compromise. Drake's triumphant return from Cadiz was not met with the universal acclaim one might expect after such a decisive strategic victory. Instead, it was greeted with a tempest of political controversy and professional resentment. Sir Francis Drake, the triumphant architect of the singeing of the beard, was still fundamentally an outsider, a privateer elevated by necessity, whose actions constantly threatened to destabilize the delicate diplomacy of the court. The official naval establishment, led by the traditional and conservative figures in the Admiralty, viewed Drake's actions with deep suspicion. His success confirmed their greatest fear, that the rules of war, the established hierarchies, and the cautious approach they championed were all rendered obsolete by one man's audacity. Drake was accused not of failure, but of insubordination and recklessness. His orders from Queen Elizabeth were deliberately vague, granting him license to impeach the Spanish forces. However, his decision to sail directly into Cadiz and spend 2 full days ravaging the port, rather than simply attempting a less risky blockade, was deemed an excessive use of force and a dangerous provocation that might escalate the war beyond England's control. The court of Queen Elizabeth I was a viper's nest of factions. The cautious, peace-minded elements, who still held out hope for a negotiated settlement with Spain, saw Drake as a dangerous zealot who had destroyed any chance of peace. They argued that his immense glory and the vast wealth he captured during the subsequent cruise to the Azores only served to enrich himself while dragging the nation further into ruinous conflict. The political fallout centered on the question of authority and discipline. Could the Queen truly afford to have her wars led by a man who treated official orders as mere suggestions? Meanwhile, across Europe, the news of the raid ignited the unquenchable wrath of King Philip II. The humiliation was personal, public, and strategically ruinous. Philip's controlled fury was not expressed in wild outbursts, but in cold, rigid determination. The news from Cadiz confirmed his profound conviction that war against England was not merely a political necessity, but a divine mandate. Drake's actions served only to fuel Philip's religious fanaticism and harden his resolve to launch the Armada. Philip immediately ordered his crippled logistical operation to be repaired, but with a new sense of urgency and bitterness. He wrote to his envoys demanding vengeance and accelerating the collection of new supplies, no matter the cost or the quality. The raid solidified his image of Drake as the personal agent of the devil, and the English campaign as a holy war against heresy. The king's wrath was now less about securing political advantage and more about exacting a righteous, total retribution for the profound slight to his dignity and his God. Thus, Drake returned to a paradoxical situation. He was a national hero to the common people, hailed as the man who defied the Spanish Empire, but he was simultaneously a political pariah among his peers, facing potential professional censure for his glorious victory. The controversy underscored the desperate nature of the war itself. England could only survive by breaking the rules, and Drake was the man uniquely willing, and able, to do so, even if it meant challenging the very structures of authority that employed him. His glory was a defiant, self-made thing, constantly shadowed by the cold, calculating fury of the most powerful monarch on earth. The true, often forgotten truth of the Cadiz raid lay in a single, invaluable commodity Drake purchased for his nation: time. It was a strategic masterstroke whose impact rippled across the entirety of 1587 and into the climactic year of 1588. By destroying the Spanish logistics and forcing Philip II into a prolonged, frantic cycle of repair and resupply, Drake essentially delayed the sailing of the Invincible Armada by a crucial 10 to 12 months. Without this delay, the subsequent victory over the Armada in the English Channel would have been impossible. Had the Armada sailed on schedule in the summer of 1587, as Philip had intended, England would have been caught tragically unprepared. Queen Elizabeth's finances were stretched, the navy was poorly organized, and the critical coastal defenses were woefully incomplete. The Conservative Admiralty would not have had the necessary months to fully man, provision, and integrate the diverse fighting ships needed to defend the Channel. The great Spanish army, led by the Duke of Parma, would have found the English Channel undefended, its landing sites unfortified, and its chances of establishing a beachhead on English soil exponentially higher. The delay granted by Cadiz changed everything. It provided the vital breathing room for Elizabeth's government to overcome its political paralysis. The year 1587 became a furious, yet organized, scramble for preparation. Funds were finally secured, often through desperate loans and private subscriptions, to finance the necessary naval buildup. Shipwrights worked tirelessly to complete the new, faster galleons based on Drake's revolutionary design principles. Most importantly, the time allowed Lord Howard of Effingham, the nominal commander, to fully integrate the diverse elements of the English defence, the Royal Navy, the armed merchantmen, and the privateers like Drake, into a cohesive, functional fighting force. This year was used not just for building, but for training. The English crews, particularly the gunners, honed their skills in the open sea, practicing the rapid-fire, maneuverable tactics that Drake had championed. This period of intense preparation ensured that when the Spanish finally appeared in 1588, the English fleet was no longer a collection of disparate vessels, but a quick, agile, and tactically superior unit, perfectly positioned to exploit the weaknesses of the slow, cumbersome Spanish fleet. Cadiz was the precursor to the eventual Armada victory. It was a victory achieved without a single major sea battle. By crippling the Armada's logistical capacity and forcing Philip to wait, Drake ensured that when the Spanish finally entered the Channel in 1588, they were already compromised. They were reliant on inferior, quickly gathered provisions that led to widespread illness and low morale. Their ships were hastily repaired and their timetable had been shattered. In essence, Drake's strategic masterstroke was not just about fire and gold, it was about control of the calendar. He secured the English Channel, and therefore England's survival, a full year before the actual invasion. This action moved the conflict from a near-certain Spanish victory to a genuine, hard-fought contest, giving England the indispensable opportunity to face the colossal threat not with desperation, but with prepared agility and superior discipline. The audacious success of the Cadiz raid, culminating in the destruction of the Spanish supply fleet and the profound strategic delay, signaled far more than a temporary English reprieve. It marked the beginning of a fundamental revolution in naval warfare and the end of the lumbering galleon era. Drake's actions were a practical demonstration that the future of naval power belonged not to the sheer bulk of the Spanish tradition, but to the swiftness and maneuverability of the English design. For nearly a century, the Spanish galleon had dominated the seas. These massive vessels were designed primarily as floating fortresses, high-castled ships intended to transport vast numbers of soldiers across oceans and engage in combat by closing the distance and relying on boarding actions. Their design prioritized size, troop capacity, and sheer defensive height over speed or agility. The galleon was the naval embodiment of the Spanish imperial doctrine: slow, methodical, overwhelming mass. Drake's victory at Cadiz exposed the fatal flaw in this philosophy. Inside the narrow confines of the harbour, the galleon's size became a crippling liability. They were unable to turn quickly, their high superstructures presented a massive target, and their heavy cannons, designed for a slow, steady engagement, could not cope with the rapid, evasive action of the English ships. Cadiz proved that the doctrine of ship as castle was obsolete. In contrast, the English ships, exemplified by the Queen's vessels Drake commanded, were lower, longer, and faster. They were built on the innovative principle of the race-built galleon, a design that sacrificed troop capacity for superior sailing performance and stability, allowing them to carry heavier cannons lower to the water. This enabled them to fire more devastating, accurate broadsides without capsizing. Drake and his captains understood that the war would be won by artillery, not infantry, at sea. Their ships were designed to outrun, outmaneuver, and outgun their opponents from a distance, never allowing the Spanish the opportunity to grapple and board. The Cadiz raid served as the final, violent proof that this new naval heresy worked. Drake used the Spanish-owned ships, the supply fleet, as targets, forcing the powerful galleons to watch helplessly as their crucial logistical support burned. It was a strategic humiliation that validated the English shift towards dynamic warfare. This tactical shift would be confirmed the following year with the defeat of the Armada, but its seeds were sown in the fiery chaos of Cadiz. The world witnessed the dawn of the true age of sail, where the ship itself was the weapon. Naval architecture across Europe began to shift away from the bulky, defensive galleon towards sleeker, faster fighting ships, precursors to the great warships of the 17th and 18th centuries. The end of the galleon era was marked by the realization that speed and focused firepower were the ultimate currencies of naval power, a revolutionary truth hammered home by a small fleet led by a former privateer who had dared to break every rule of maritime war. The final, enduring legacy of Sir Francis Drake and the Cadiz raid is perhaps the most profound contradiction in English military history. Drake did not win a glorious, decisive fleet engagement. He won a strategic victory through an act of unprecedented logistical terrorism. His genius lay not in courage, though he possessed it in spades, but in his cold, ruthless calculation that war is ultimately an exercise in resource denial. The story of Cadiz is the story of the victory that was never fought. The true measure of Drake's success is found in the failure of the Armada a year later. When the Spanish fleet finally sailed in 1588, it was not the awe-inspiring, perfectly provisioned force Philip had intended. It was a fleet hampered by spoiled food, disease-ridden crews, and hasty, makeshift repairs. The barrels that Drake burned at Cadiz had to be replaced quickly, often using inferior wood and inadequate curing techniques. The resulting tainted water and provisions led to rampant scurvy and dysentery before the Armada even reached the English Channel. Drake had crippled the Spanish long before the English Navy fired the first decisive shot off Plymouth. This strategic brilliance ensures Drake's place as a forgotten genius in the annals of naval warfare. While popular history often focuses on the heroism of the final fleet defense in 1588, it often minimizes the man who bought England the time to prepare and who guaranteed the enemy would arrive already compromised. Drake's contribution was not the knockout blow, but the crippling wound inflicted a year prior, an action that turned a potential English massacre into a genuine contest. His genius lay in seeing beyond the immediate tactical landscape to the logistical heart of the vast Spanish Empire. He understood that a Goliath is best defeated not by fighting him head-on, but by cutting his supply lines and shattering his confidence. The controversy that followed him to his death, his insubordination, his privateering, his political audacity, only solidifies his legacy as a man whose methods were always outside the conventional bounds of his time. He was a champion of a new, fluid, dynamic style of war that terrified the static hierarchies of the established order, both Spanish and English. He proved that naval power was shifting from the realm of aristocratic land soldiers carried to sea to the domain of the professional mariner who understood the subtle language of wind, tide, and cannon caliber. Ultimately, Drake's raid was a seminal moment that secured the independence of a nation and forever changed the future course of global power. By delaying the Armada, he ensured the survival of Protestant England, allowing it to consolidate its identity and eventually embark on its own course of global exploration and expansion. He did not merely win a battle, he altered the trajectory of European history, ensuring that the New World would not be solely dominated by a single Catholic power. The enduring image of Sir Francis Drake is that of the pirate who became a national savior, a figure whose courage was overshadowed only by his strategic foresight. He taught the world that the greatest victories are often found not in the smoke of a grand, decisive battle, but in the relentless, meticulous destruction of the enemy's means to fight. The ashes of Cadiz were the physical evidence of the victory that was never fought, guaranteeing that when the inevitable confrontation came, England was prepared, and the Invincible Armada was already fatally wounded. Drake's raid remains a timeless testament to the power of audacity and tactical genius in the face of impossible odds.